The AP voters in KenPom agreed on a lot of things, but where to rank Rutgers, that was not one of them.
You are Locked On College Basketball, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day.
What's up, folks? Welcome into the Locked On College Basketball Podcast, a daily national college hoop show, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. I am your host, Andy Patton, joined today by our regular guest, Leaf Tulane, and you are joining us at the place to get your college basketball content every single day, Monday through Friday, every single week of the year. We are here throughout the offseason, and now as we are very, very close to the college basketball season returning, less than 3 weeks until the first official games. We're already starting to see scrimmages pop up. It is an exciting time to be a college basketball fan. Folks, want to thank all of you who have made this show your first listen or your first watch of the day, and remind you to come hang out with us in our Locked On College Basketball Discord channel if you have not done so yet. It is free to join, and there's a link in the show notes on audio or video platforms. Today's episode is brought to you by FanDuel. Folks, place your first $5 bet, and you will get started with $200 in bonus bets guaranteed. Just visit FanDuel.com to get started. Well, Leaf and I are continuing the conversation that Isaac and I had on Wednesday's episode, kind of talking about the AP poll, the results that we saw, some surprises there. We're also going to do some comparison with the KenPom rankings, which came out around the same time, a few hours before the AP poll was officially released, kind of compare the teams that are very far apart in the AP poll and in the KenPom rankings, what we think that might mean, who is going to be quote unquote right at the end of the season in that area. We're also going to take a look at the top 10 offenses and defenses, according to KenPom's adjusted offensive and defensive efficiency ratings. And then we're going to close out the show looking at the conferences, which conferences are ranked the highest in KenPom's rankings and how we think that might play out this season. Leaf, we want to start with some kind of superlatives. A look at the highest ranked teams in the AP poll that weren't in KenPom's top 25 and vice versa. And we want to start the conversation talking about the team that had the biggest discrepancy between where they showed up in the AP poll and where they showed up in the KenPom rankings. And that is the Rutgers Scarlet Knights. The AP voters had Rutgers come in at number 25, the last ranked team in the poll. Bart Torvik has Rutgers at 19, so there's certainly some validity to having this team as a top 25 team. Yet, KenPom's data has Rutgers all the way down at 63. Now, part of this, or I think another, just to really kind of put this into perspective here, the AP voters had Rutgers as the fourth-ranked Big Ten team. There's three other Big Ten teams in the top 25, Purdue, Indiana, and UCLA, and then Rutgers. Meanwhile, KenPom's data has Rutgers 17th in the Big Ten. That is second to last. I feel pretty confident in saying Rutgers is probably not going to finish 17th in the Big Ten, although I'm also not super confident they're going to finish fourth. Obviously, when looking at preseason rankings, especially at sites like KenPom and Torvik and Evan Mia and other places that do this, when you're a team that's relying heavily on freshmen, the way that Rutgers is going to with, of course, Ace Bailey and Dylan Harper, it's really hard to kind of be able to extrapolate that data in a way that's super reliable. I love KenPom's data. This is certainly not in any way trying to trash the site and the way that he comes up with his metrics, because it's been very valuable for decades now at this point. But this is the kind of team that is the perfect way for preseason hype, for human voters versus actual analytics data to have a really big spread on this. What's your kind of make or thought here on this Rutgers team, seeing this kind of big discrepancy between the computers and the voters at this point?
See, I'll start by saying I was not surprised to see them in the poll. It's like when Kentucky doesn't have a great team, or a team that you don't know much about, or Duke for that matter, and they're automatically in the poll.
Yep.
And it's because they generate excitement. In this case, Rutgers isn't the flashiest program, but what they do have is two of the top 3 rated prospects in collegiate basketball.
Right.
And that's why they're in the AP poll. Now, the discrepancy between Torvik and KenPom is more interesting to me.
Yes.
Because I don't know exactly what constitutes the discrepancy, because I'd imagine KenPom plugs in returning players and versus what they lost. They lost their best player last year, Cliff Omarui. And so you lose those type of players, and then I'm a little more skeptical. obviously, having watched Dylan Harper and
Mhm.
Ace Bailey, you think, okay, now they can replace this guy, and their top tier NBA level talent can make the team better and take the jump for losing what a guy in Cliff Omarui through 4 years at Rutgers meant to the
Right.
program. Who knows? But I'll say this: I think they're probably the 8th or ninth best team in the Big Ten this
Mhm.
year.
Yeah.
I was actually going through this exercise last night,
Mhm.
and I kind of broke it into tiers. And I had a tier one of like 5 teams that was constituted of 5 teams. And I kind of said the teams that could, if everything goes right, make a Sweet 16. I don't really love the Big Ten's top end talent. And then I had
Mhm.
a group of like 7 or 8 teams from 6 through 13, I believe it was, maybe
Yeah.
through 12. But they're basically, some of these guys are going to make the tournament. I think Rutgers falls in that group. Some of
Mhm.
them are going to make the tournament. And so if you put that into KenPom to bring it full circle, you're probably not going to see a team ranked 63rd, because that's the teams that make the tournament not ranked there. You're going to see them ranked 35th. You split
Right.
19 and 63, right about there. So that's kind of where I am. And I know it's a bit of a cop out, but that's before I even knew this was the conversation topic today. I was just plugging in my own metrics of my own brain of,
Mhm.
this is what team I think finishes where. And I kind of come to that conclusion. If you take 8th or ninth on the Big Ten, I'd be curious. I haven't actually searched it through KenPom, but I bet 8th or ninth in the Big Ten is 35th.
Yeah, it's right around there actually, and we'll talk about that a little later in the show. But I think my Big Ten power rankings, I think I had Rutgers ninth, so we're right in the same conversation there, kind of right splitting what we see with KenPom's data and with the AP voters at this point. And it's kind of funny you mentioned like teams that tend to get more favorably rated by the humans in the AP voters, and that's kind of the perfect segue into the next topic, because it's a list of exactly those teams, effectively the 5 teams that are in the AP top 25 that are not in the KenPom top 25. And obviously Rutgers is one of those teams, but the other ones are Indiana, Florida, UCLA, Kentucky, and Ole Miss. And for the most part, that tracks. Kentucky and UCLA are historically, our blue blood programs, so they're going to get some name recognition. They're going to get some brand awareness that helps them get rated a little higher in the AP poll. Kentucky is exactly what you said. They're a very unknown team, and they're not very freshman heavy. None of these teams, in fact, are very freshman heavy, but they're a team that we haven't seen them play together. We haven't seen very many of these guys play in Mark Pope's system. A few of them have. So they're kind of a tough team to pin down. KenPom has Kentucky 42nd, and the AP voters have them 23rd. So that's a fairly significant difference. But again, I think even Ken would tell you a team like Kentucky, his computer system isn't really designed to figure out how to rank a team where there's 0 returners on the roster. And that's true of Kentucky. And Indiana and UCLA are not. They don't have 0 returners. In fact, Indiana has a couple of important returners in Mbako and Malik Renault, but they also have a lot of newcomers as well. Both programs do. And so I think the system is just not designed for teams that have as much roster turnaround as these teams do. I'll tell you right now, I haven't done my top 25. I am not going to have Indiana 17th. I'm probably not going to have Indiana ranked. I'm very skeptical about how this roster comes together. I know you and I have talked about this already this offseason because it feels like there's not enough floor spacing and shooting. I'm also fairly skeptical of UCLA. UCLA is 22nd in the AP poll, but KenPom does have them 26th, so very close together. They're all basically a cop-out to have here since they're almost a top 25 team, but they were not very good last year, and while I like some of the additions, I'm not sure they're going to jump from as bad as they were last year to being a top 25 team. But yeah, I think your general point that a lot of well-regarded teams or well-known historical teams are going to get a bit of a boost in a preseason AP poll where we haven't seen any games yet. That seems to track with the data here. But anything else in this kind of group of teams here kind of stand out to you?
Well, obviously, transfer portal is going to make KenPom and Bart Torvik and all these places reevaluate how they go offseason to offseason. But the thing I will point out is there at least are known commodities joining for the likes of Indiana. Like Umar Ballo is a known commodity. I don't know how you figure it in, because now it becomes a fit thing. Because if you were to ask me to rank talent of rosters, Indiana's certainly top 17. Like they spent a ton of money and they got a bunch of really good players like Miles Rice, Kanan Carlisle. I think are both very good. Do they play well together? I don't know. Does that push Galloway down? Does Renew, Mbako, and Ballo work as a front line? Probably not. So it's going to be about coaching in that regard. And I think one thing that is impossible to understand is chemistry and coaching on these things. So I actually believe in the coaching of Mick Cronin.
Yeah.
So I'm actually pretty high on UCLA. I think they're going to be a top 5 finisher in the Big Ten in their first year. As for Indiana, they're the most talented team in the Big Ten, in my opinion, but I wouldn't pick them first, even though I think by a wide margin they're more talented than Purdue. I think they're more talented than Oregon and UCLA and even Illinois, to be honest with you. But those are my top 5 teams, and I think I'd take Indiana 4th or 5th. So the reason I bring that up about the Big Ten is you look at some of these other teams that have historical success. You look at Illinois in recent years, and it's different because their team is so different. So I think it's hard to evaluate, and I'll be curious to see which teams that have this turnover KenPom most accurately predicts. Because, for instance, Duke always has this turnover, but you can plug and play. Has it changed with Shire? A little bit, because you get some transfers that help there be some maturity, and it's not all one and dones. I think you're going to see a more and more accurate representation year in and year out in the next coming years as the weight of transfer importance is more accurately diagnosed.
Yeah, I agree with you 100%. And what we want to do now is move on and kind of do the inverse of this conversation. Talk about KenPom teams, highly regarded KenPom teams that are in his top 25 that did not make it into the AP poll, and what that might mean for those particular programs. And we're going to get to that in just a second. But first, folks, let's talk about FanDuel. NFL fans, you can get started on the season with a huge return on FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. Right now, when you get a hunch in the middle of a game, you can check out the latest stats, view live play-by-play, and so much more, all on the same page where you place your bets. And right now, you can get started with $200 in bonus bets guaranteed when you place your first $5 bet. And if you're starting to look at some 2025 national championship odds right now, they're not #1 in the AP poll, but Duke has the highest odds of winning that national championship, plus 950 at KenPom right now. That's followed by Houston and Kansas, both at plus 1,000. UConn is next at plus 1,100, going for that three-peat. And then Alabama comes in after that at plus 1,400. If you like those odds, they also got Wooden Award odds, conference tournament winners, all sorts of great stuff on FanDuel. Check it out, FanDuel.com. America's #1 sportsbook. All right, Leaf, continuing our conversation here, talking about the teams in the AP poll, teams in KenPom, the differences that we've seen in those rankings in the preseason. Here we talked about the highest ranked AP, or the team in the top 25 that was the lowest ranked at KenPom. Now we're going to talk about the highest team in KenPom's ranking that was not in the AP poll. And that team is the Red Raiders of Texas Tech, who KenPom had 15th in his first preseason ranking of the season. They were 4th among teams receiving votes, which would technically put them at 29th in the AP poll, if you want to count it that way. So they got some votes, they got some love, they got some attention from the AP voters, but KenPom is pretty high on this Red Raiders team. Bart Torvik splits the difference here. He's got them at 20. So I think, again, we're looking at the difference between 15, 20, and 29, especially when we're talking about the preseason, is fairly minimal. I'm intrigued by this Texas Tech team. Grant McCaslin has done an awesome job. They lost a lot of talent from last year's team, Pop Isaacs being a huge transfer departure, but they bring in JT Toppin from New Mexico. I think he's going to be a big-time player for them. So this feels about right to me. Again, the difference is not as pronounced as it was with Rutgers in the first segment there. But I am intrigued by this Texas Tech team. And I think, the Big 12 is so top heavy with that top 5 teams all in the top 10 of the AP poll. So it feels to me like Tech is going to be in that kind of 6 to 8 range. And where that falls in the actual rankings is, I don't want to say irrelevant necessarily, but this is a team that looks like an NCAA tournament team, that looks like a top half finisher in the Big 12 that I think is going to have another productive season in Lubbock.
I actually really like this Texas Tech team. I would have them ranked. And I think if anyone's going to dethrone the top 5 of the Big 12 that every single prediction has, it's in these metrics, it's reflected in all of these metrics, it's reflected in all of the preseason polls, it's reflected in the AP top 25. That is Kansas, some variation of this. Kansas, Houston as the top 2, Iowa State as the 3rd, 4th Baylor, 5th Arizona. Everyone's got it. If anyone's going to infiltrate that, it's Texas Tech in the Big 12. And I say that as someone who's pretty high on BYU, as someone who believes that Cincinnati's going to be better, and they lost a ton of close games last year. But Texas Tech's the one most equipped to make this run. They did have a big loss in Pop Isaacs, no doubt about it. But I think JT Toppin and what he brings to Texas Tech is more important than what Joe Toussaint and Texas Tech leading scorer, Pop Isaacs, lost in the way of the transfer portal. It giveth and it taketh. However, you're going to find replacement to score. McCaslin's played as the slowest paces of the slowest paces when he was at North Texas. He figured out how to play quickly and maximize the team to get to the 60 that was nowhere near as talented as this team. They return Chance McMillan, Williams, actually both Williamses, JT Toppin, and I just think that this team's well-equipped and extremely well-coached. So you're going to see a theme of this in terms of the projections. The coaching, to me, really matters, and how to best take, one, the production of years past of your teams and elevate them, or if you're taking a transfer-heavy team, how much faith do I have in the coach to put those transfers in a situation to succeed and coalesce as a unit?
The next conversation is going to be very fascinating, since we've kind of turned a lot of these team-based conversations around coaching, because this group of teams that we're about to talk about has some coaches that are very well-renowned and some coaches that maybe are not so well-renowned. These are the 5 teams that are in KenPom's top 25 that were not in the AP top 25. Number 1 is St. John's. Now, St. John's was the top vote getter that did not make, the second highest vote getter that did not make the top 25. So they're 27th, according to the AP poll. They're 19th in KenPom's rankings. Next up was Villanova, and this was a big shock to me. Villanova's 20th in KenPom's preseason rankings. They did not receive a single vote in the AP poll, which is more what I would have expected at this point after 2 disappointing seasons for Kyle Neptune. BYU's 21st in the KenPom rankings, 35th according to the receiving votes for the AP. Illinois 23rd and 26th, so basically not really much of a difference there. And then Clemson, which is 24th in the KenPom rankings and tied for 39th among the 20-plus teams that received votes that did not make the top 25. Again, to me, I think, Leaf, the obvious standout here is Villanova. I'm not sure there are any people outside of tremendous Villanova homers who see this team realistically as a top 20 team at this point. KenPom has them 14th in adjusted defensive efficiency. We did see Villanova scrimmage Penn State and win that game. Penn State was not playing Ace Baldwin, didn't play their best player, and it was like a 2-point victory. So, and it's a exhibition game, so they really
Eric
don't take
Dixon
those.
Scored 38.
Right, I was gonna say, didn't Eric Dixon go off for like almost a 40 burger in that game?
Yeah, so,
I don't hate this Villanova team. I think the duo of Dixon and Poplar is pretty good, but Kyle Neptune hasn't done enough for me to feel particularly confident that he can maximize the talent on this team, and to be in the top 25 conversation just feels very premature for me at this point.
Oh, I agree with you. I think Eric Dixon is a Big East Player of the Year candidate. I think that Poplar is a guy who, if everything went right last year, could have been a first-round pick or at least a drafted player.
Yeah.
He returns home to his hometown of Philadelphia. So you have faith and optimism there. However, you lost a ton. You didn't replace a point guard. Mark Armstrong leaves. Brendan Hausen leaves.
Yeah.
All these guys leave. Justin Moore is gone. You have all these things happen, and I don't think there's any reason for defensive optimism aside from the fact that they were okay at it last year, but they weren't all that spectacular.
Right.
So I don't know what the analytics say there. Maybe they're playing a different tempo, a different pace, going to force more turnovers, but that wouldn't be analytically derived. So that one puzzles me quite a bit. And then I would say the interesting part is you look at some of these coaches, and Rick Pitino is the one that is the best known, the most well-regarded coach on that list, but he's the biggest question mark to me.
Yeah.
Because last year he talked in his own press conference. I was actually at the game that prompted that, funnily enough, against Seton Hall. He talked about we don't have enough guys with athleticism. Well, he goes and gets Davon Smith and Kadari Richmond. So you have this switching of mentality and play style, which fits better what Pitino did at Louisville with Peyton Siva, Russ Smith, all these guys, and they'd get up in your grill and press. But do you have that much faith in losing Joel Soriano? They're going to be able to replicate that sort of production on the interior. Do you think they're going to be able to shoot better? I think that's the most interesting one. I think almost that the reason that they were higher in terms of the AP poll, I know they just missed it, is because of the name brand, because they do have a lot of moving pieces. But I think St. John's is going to be better this year than they were in the previous season, but they weren't very good, and that's why they missed the tournament.
Yeah. Zubi Ejiofor feels like a huge kind of hinge for that team in the front court. He needs to be a a big time enforcer, a big time player for that team to reach the ceiling that a lot of people kind of have projected for them. Wanted to move on quickly, Leaf, here before we get into our conference projections and rankings here using KenPom's data. There's five teams that are in both the top 10 in adjusted offensive and defensive efficiency coming into the season. And the question for you is pretty simple. Looking at these five teams, and I'll list them here in a second, do you think that we are looking at a national champion among this group of five teams? Those five teams that are in the top 10 in both are Houston, Duke, Auburn, UConn, and Kansas. Pretty darn good group of teams right there, Leaf. Do you think, obviously it's too early to project, and I think I would take the field over these five, but honestly, I'm not 100% sure that I would. This is a group of teams that all have a very realistic chance of contending for a championship. What are your thoughts on this group here?
Well, I don't think Auburn can contend for a championship, even though I like Bruce Pearl, and I think Auburn's probably the second best team in the SEC, which will be loaded. I just don't know if I believe in their guard play enough, so I'm just going by process of elimination here. JP Pegues has to take a huge leap up, as does Denver Jones. Houston, I have the same issue I've had the last couple of years. You lose your best player, in my opinion, and I won't say program history because they had Akeem Olajuwon and Clyde Drexler, but recent program history, because I think Shed was better than Sasser, and I think he was better than Walker. And now you're supposed to be better. And I know it's not better by a lot, but this is a team that's projected to be a champion right here based on these metrics, and they fare the best according to the metrics. So I don't know if I believe in that. I don't know if I believe in LJ Cryer as a first-team All-American, which you'd need to be to perpetuate yourselves into championship contention. So that leaves Duke, UConn, and Kansas. I can poke holes, but they're nitpicking at those ones. Duke, you need to grow up and play and figure out what's the best lineup to play. But that's a great question to have. UConn's got the best coach in the country, in my opinion, and Dan Hurley. And you look at what they've got, and I don't necessarily love their backcourt, but I think you could make that same argument. You didn't know what Tristan Newton and what's his name, Stephon Castle, were going to be last year. And then I don't think that Kansas has that many holes to poke. Mine would be, can Bill Self, who's an amazing coach, maybe the second best coach in the country currently, figure out how to play the best five? So honestly, the reason I take the field is because I think Alabama's quite good. And if you replaced Alabama over Auburn, I'd probably say I would take it, just because I like a little risk. So I'll take the 63 other teams over this five, but I certainly would not be surprised if one of Duke, UConn, or Kansas cuts down the net. I do like Houston for what it's worth. I think they'll win the Big 12, but I just don't know if I see them cutting down the nets.
Yeah, Houston's obviously had some injury issues the last couple of tournaments, has really hampered them, but I'm with you on that. I think Houston's ability to get into that conversation or to stay in that conversation throughout the year depends on some depth options. Terrence Arsenault taking a leap after missing most of last year with an injury, I think, is a big part of the equation for them. But yeah, we kind of talked about it a little bit. The who's going to play the true one for that team feels like a question that I would like to have some more answers to before really knowing. But with Duke, I'll talk about them quickly before we get into the conference conversation. I like that John Shire went out and got some veteran players to play around this young group of freshmen. I think a lot of people look at this team and they see 5 new freshmen coming in, and they see all the players that left after last year, like Jeremy Roach and of course Kyle Filipowski and many others, and they think, well, this team's just too young. Young teams aren't winning the championships anymore. And it's like, yeah, they have a lot of freshmen, but they also have Mason Gillis, who's been to a national championship game, who comes in as a key role player. They get Zion James, who comes in from the American Athletic Conference, averaged 15 points a game, who's going to be a big time player for them. They get the big man from Syracuse coming in as well. Like, this is just a team that I think has enough depth and enough kind of balance between veterans and young players that it's like you said, it's about Shire finding the right matchups, finding the right lineups and things like that. But if he can do that, I think this team is absolutely in that conversation, along with the other aforementioned team. And I'm with you. Auburn, maybe they're in the conversation, but if you replace them with Bama, this becomes a pretty clear cut. Like, yeah, those are arguably the 5 teams most likely to win the championship, and for good reason. KenPom's data has got a lot of good indication that these 5 teams are going to be very, very good this upcoming season. Leaf, let's move on and talk about our conference rankings here. Not our conference rankings, KenPom's conference rankings. The SEC is his highest rated conference, but unsurprisingly, the Big 12 has more top 25 teams. We're going to talk about that, talk about the depth in these leagues and the rest of the Power Conference programs, all coming up in just a second. But first, we're going to talk about hymns. Guys, if you ever feel like you need a little boost in the bedroom, it's time you stop worrying about your performance and get hymns. So you can feel confident knowing that everything's going to be just fine whenever you're in the mood. HIMS is changing men's healthcare by providing you with access to affordable sexual health treatments from the comfort of your couch. The process is 100% online, so there's no need for uncomfortable doctor visits. Just answer a series of questions on the site, and a medical provider will determine the right treatment option for you. If prescribed, your medication ships directly to you in discreet packaging for free. No insurance is needed, and one low price covers everything. With hundreds of thousands of trusted subscribers, HIMS can help you find the ED option that works for you. Start your free online visit today at hims.com/lockedon. That's HIMS.com/lockedon for your personalized ED treatment options. The products mentioned are chewable compounded products which are not available by or verified for safety or effectiveness by the FDA. Prescriptions require an online consultation with a healthcare provider who will determine if appropriate restrictions do apply. That's HIMS, HIMS.com. All right, Leaf, closing out the show today, talking KenPom once again, but this time looking at the conference rankings for KenPom heading into the upcoming college basketball season. And as it has been the case, a lot of the conversation this coming into the season and really over the last 2 years or so has been kind of comparing the Big 12 with the SEC. The Big East is always in that conversation. Of course, Big 10 and ACC to some extent as well. The ACC has not been as high in this conversation as they have been historically, just because outside of Duke and North Carolina, they're a bit more top heavy than they used to be. Let's put it that way. But the SEC is number one in KenPom's conference rankings, just ahead of the Big 12, very close. Part of it is just this depth. And we kind of knew this with the Big 12. The Big 12 brought in 4 new schools this offseason. One of them is Arizona, which significantly helps add to the top heaviness of the Big 12. But the other 3 programs, Colorado, Arizona State, and Utah, are all towards the bottom of the conference's overall rankings, and all of them are lower than every single team in the SEC except for Vanderbilt. Vanderbilt is 96th. Every other team in the SEC is in the top 67. 6 of them are in the top 25. That's Auburn, Bama, Tennessee, A&M, Texas, and Arkansas. Whereas with the Big 12, you have 8 teams that are all in the top 21, which is incredible. But then you have a huge gap, 4 teams between 49 and 71. And then you have your 4 teams that are all outside the top 80, Colorado and Utah being among them, alongside West Virginia and Oklahoma State. Obviously, those 2 programs have new coaches. It's possible if they're able to turn things around and boost the bottom of the conference a little bit, that's a big help for the Big 12. But effectively, the question becomes, Leaf, which of these 2 conferences, top to bottom, do you think is better heading into the season? Or is there another conference that you think is better overall than either the Big 12 or the SEC?
So if you ask me to fully choose, I would take the Big 12 because I think they have more teams that can be on the 1 and 2 lines.
Yeah,
and
I agree.
This is something that I've been really passionate about the last few years when people have started to say the Big 12's conference, it's as good as it's been ever. Well, I would argue in 2019, just to go on a mini rant, I could go on for a lot longer, but for the mini rant, 2019, there was 3 1 seeds from one conference.
Yeah.
There also was another two Sweet 16 teams from that same conference that season. So you look at conferences. That's how I measured it. It's not necessarily tournament results, because sometimes crazy things happen. A 1 can beat a 16. We've seen it twice now. You can see a 2 beat a 15, or 15 beat a 2, excuse me. And you look at all that and you say, whatever. But what I do care about is how many teams on their given day can make it to a Final Four. Right. And if you look at the SEC, I just voiced skepticism about the team I think second, but I think they're really good in Auburn. I don't think Auburn's going to be higher than a 3 or 4 seed because they play too many good teams. Their non-conference schedule is ridiculous. Their in-conference schedule is also ridiculous. I think that's the second best team in the SEC, though, behind Alabama. So the reason I bring that up is the Big 12 last year, I think, was erroneous in saying we're so dominant. Yes, they had a lot of good teams, but I said this all year, so this is not hindsight. I'm going to take a little victory lap here. Kansas wasn't very good last year. Yet that was the crown jewel, and they deserved to be because of their history. Houston was the only team with a sliver of a chance to cut the nets. However, as we said all season, or at least I said all season, I believe Andy was on board with me, they weren't even close to as good as UConn, and frankly, not as good as Purdue either. But they could have beaten Purdue on the wrong day. So that's one team. Then you go to Iowa State, who's a 2 seed. they didn't have the making of a championship team. They had too many moving pieces, and they were inefficient on one side of the basketball with being offense. So you need to get better on that end. You look at all that team. Baylor was the most fraudulent 3 seed they've been in quite a while. You look at all these teams, and I don't think they're that great. This year, you look at the Big 12, and you add Arizona, who also has been fraudulent in years past, but they've been a 1 and a 2 seed most of the last 5 years.
Yeah.
Like since Tommy Lloyd's taken over, they've been a 1, a 2, and a 2. That's fabulous. Now you look at what Iowa State does. They bring back the exact same core and they get better. And that's your third best team. Kansas has the best portal in the history of the transfer portal. You have Houston, who's projected to win the conference along with Kansas, and we already talked about them. So that's 5 teams right there. Speaking of Baylor as well, bringing in VJ Edgecombe, the presumptuous first team, all freshman, best freshman in America, along with Cooper Flagg conversation. And then you bring up the Texas Tech, who's 15th in KenPom. You bring up Kansas State, who spent $4 million in the transfer portal. You bring in BYU, who has 2 guys that they believe can be first-round picks. So that's a long-winded way of saying they have a chance this year to actually be a historically good conference, not the false claims that they've made the last few years of being very good because they've had Kansas and Baylor especially raise the banners. They actually have conference depth and top-end depth, whereas the SEC has a number 1 seed caliber team, a team in Auburn, a team in you could go from Auburn to Texas and where they're predicted. And for those of you wondering, that's about Auburn, Tennessee, Arkansas, and you have Florida before Texas. Those are the 7 teams. But you could go from 2 through 7. You could spin it any which way. That said, the SEC could get 12 teams in. They won't, but like they have 12 teams. I think have the capacity to get in, and that's better than any conference has ever had. But they just added teams.
Yeah. For me, like I agree with you. I think you look at like 6 through 10 in each of these conferences, and I think I think a lot of people would probably argue that the SEC's 6 through 10 is better than the Big 12 6 through 10, but I think it's very close. And I think the top 5 in the Big 12 is pretty clearly better than the top 5 in the SEC. So to me, a slight, the SEC being slightly better in that middle of the pack doesn't move the needle for me as much. I think it depends a lot on how good Kentucky and Arkansas look in their first years with new coaches. That's a huge hinge in the SEC. If both those teams exceed expectations, that's going to raise the profile. Not really the profile, it's going to raise the level of just competition in that conference. And then for the Big 12, it's similar conversation with BYU, obviously having a new coach and a pretty new look roster. They kind of feel like a team right in that conversation. The only team you didn't mention that I'll toss in there is Cincinnati. I'm not as high on them as KenPom has Cincinnati 17th, which feels very high. But I do like this Cincinnati team. I like Wes Miller a lot as a coach. So I'll be interested to see if they can kind of help raise the profile of that conference as well. But want to move and look at the other 3 Power 5 conferences, the Big 10, the Big East, and the ACC. That is the order that KenPom has them. The Big 10, every single team in the Big 10 conference is in the top 75 at KenPom. It's better than the SEC, who has Vanderbilt hanging outside of that. It's better than the Big 12, who has 4 teams that are outside of the top 80. So the Big 10 has the higher floor, I suppose, in that regard, but only 2 of the teams in the Big 10 are in the top 25 at KenPom. That's Purdue and Illinois. A lot of teams in that 25 to 40 range. But it doesn't, the top end talent in the Big 10 is very clearly below both the SEC and the Big 12. And to me, having a bunch of teams in the 55 to 70 range just doesn't, I mean, most of those teams aren't going to make the tournament. You look at the teams between 46 and 59 at KenPom right now: Wisconsin, Northwestern, Nebraska, USC, Minnesota. I'd be surprised if more than one of those teams makes the NCAA tournament. So I'm not super high on the Big 10 this year. I'm not sure I like the Big 10 more than I like the Big East, who has 4 teams in the top 20 at KenPom, although we talked about Villanova seeming to be a little bit fraudulent in that area. They got 2 more in the top 30 in Marquette and Xavier. Providence is 60th, and then they got 4 teams in the top, outside the top 80, Butler, Georgetown, Seton Hall, who is like 91st, very low for Shaheen Holloway's team after a lot of departures, and then DePaul, who's at 135. So the Big East has a lot of bottom feeders and is only 11 teams. So just having multiple teams that are not good really drags down the overall strength of that conference. But its top heaviness is significantly better than the Big 10. And in fact, all of these conferences are better than the Big 10, with the ACC having 2 top teams in of course, Duke and Carolina. And I think some teams that aren't getting enough love. I think Clemson is a borderline top 25 team. And I will probably strongly consider both Pitt and Wake Forest for my top 25. I think they'll probably be just on the outside, but those are teams that I think, obviously, they both missed the tournament last year, but they're teams that I think are going to make some noise this upcoming season. And of course, Louisville being a big hinge for the ACC as well. If Pat Kelsey can get that team back rolling this year after the disaster that was the Kenny Payne era, that's going to help the ACC's overall strength of the conference as well.
I'm with you. I would put the Big East as ahead of the Big Ten if they could get more than just their 3 in.
Yeah.
They had 3. They're 22-6. Fun fact for you guys: 22-6 the last 2 NCAA tournaments. Obviously, UConn amounts for a lot of those wins. That's 12 of them. That said, you still have a good record because you got to lose if you're not winning it. And they still have good representation in that. But they need to add depth. This year, I think Xavier will make the tournament. I'm actually pretty high on the Musketeers. I think St. John's makes it, and I wouldn't be stunned if Providence makes it. So if they can get 6, their 6 is significantly better than the Big Ten 6. But the Big Ten will get 5 or 6. Yeah. They have to. They have so many good teams. So, and by good, I don't mean great, but I mean good. Yeah. So you're going to go, from my opinion, I think the top 5, UCLA. I think UCLA, Oregon, in no particular order, UCLA, Oregon, Indiana, Illinois, Purdue are all going to make it. I think you can make an argument that any of, and I bet Michigan State will make it too, but you can make the argument of any of Michigan, Ohio State, Iowa, Rutgers, Nebraska, and someone else.
Wisconsin, maybe?
No, not quite Wisconsin, but someone else in that conference will make the tournament. You're going to get someone out of there that will end up making the tournament. And that's the way I see it. And I wouldn't even be surprised if a team like Penn State gets hot and makes a run. Yeah. So you're going to have the 6 from the Big East to actually constitute being a better conference, because the Big Ten has elite depth, because they could have the 16th best team be a team like Northwestern, who's projected 15th, and they made the second round last year. So that's the way I see it, because depth does matter, but you need to have depth at the top. And I don't think the Big Ten has any team that can get past the Sweet 16.
The Big Ten is the conference that's just going to have like a team on the 8-9 line in every single region. It just feels like that's always where Big Ten teams end up, is like, oh, look, you got Nebraska versus, I don't know, like the Cincinnati or something like that on the 8-9 line, because those teams are they're good enough to make the tournament, but not really good enough to get more than just kind of, one of those 8-9 or dreaded 7-10 seeds where you're just having yourself a really tough matchup in the second round. Leaf, thank you so much for coming on to the show. Appreciate breaking down this KenPom data as we get a ton of different analytics and numbers as we get closer and closer to the start of the college basketball season. Folks, that's going to wrap it up for us today. We will be back with more fun stuff on Friday. We're also going to talk some more team previews, some conference previews. We got a few of those left. And then we got real college basketball games to analyze. We got some scrimmages coming up. We're going to talk about those. We got some actual real count in the standings basketball coming on November 4th. Incredibly excited to have the season returning. Thank you again for listening. And until next time, as always, peace out.